It began, as most strange things do, in the quiet hours of a sleepless night. Rain tapped against the window of Simon Hale's apartment, a rhythmic, soothing sound that did little to calm the storm in his mind. Simon was a writer, though not the kind celebrated on glossy magazines or whispered about on late-night shows. He wrote because the words wouldn't stop coming. He wrote because, when he didn't, the world felt too heavy, too loud, too unforgiving. And on that night, he stared at a page that had seemed blank for hours, until something peculiar began to stir. The manuscript had arrived in the mail 3 days earlier. Unmarked. Unsigned. Thick, heavy, smelling faintly of old paper and ink. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges, the sort of notebook a writer might clutch during fevered nights of creation. There was no note. No explanation. Just the book, lying on his kitchen counter as if it had always belonged to him. Simon stared at the first page for nearly an hour before the letters began to form themselves. Not in his handwriting. Not in any hand he recognized. But the words seemed alive, pulsing, scribbling themselves with an urgency that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He will die at 11. He laughed at first, a nervous, forced laugh, the kind people make when they think they're losing their minds. Of course, he thought. A prank. Someone had sent him a notebook filled with ominous lines meant to rattle him. But even as he convinced himself, a shiver ran down his spine. 11 o'clock was tonight. His phone buzzed. A news alert: a fire had broken out in a building not far from his apartment. A man had died in the blaze. The clock on his phone blinked 11. Simon froze. He hadn't written the line. He hadn't known it. And yet here it was, happening. Exactly as the manuscript had described. The following days passed in a haze of dread. Each page of the notebook was more disturbing than the last. Names appeared. Streets he had walked. People he had seen. She will fall into the river by dawn. The boy will not survive the fall from the bridge. Simon tried to dismiss it as coincidence, telling himself the mind looks for patterns. But the world seemed to conspire against him. 2 nights later, he walked past the bridge where the manuscript said the boy would fall. A small crowd had gathered. Flashing lights illuminated the water below. A child had been pulled from the river. Simon stood frozen, notebook in hand, unable to move or breathe. By now, panic had taken residence in his chest. Sleep and food became distant memories. Every moment outside felt like a risk. And yet he could not stop reading. The notebook pulled him in, insidious and magnetic, drawing him into a story that wasn't his own but felt inextricably linked to him. Friends called. Colleagues reached out. You need a break, they said. Step away from the writing for a while. Simon could not. He was tethered to the notebook, as if it were alive, whispering the fates of those around him, forcing him to watch events unfold. The notebook's lines grew more elaborate, almost intimate. Not just random deaths, but people Simon knew, people he had passed on the street, even strangers who brushed briefly against his life. He will not see the morning, one line warned. That evening, at a small cafe downtown, a man at a corner table collapsed, clutching his chest. Paramedics arrived too late. Simon ran, but not before catching sight of the notebook, its pages fluttering like mocking wings. His apartment became a fortress. Windows shuttered. Phones always at hand. He stopped leaving. The world outside became numbers, statistics in a ledger he did not want to tally. He began keeping his own notebook, mapping the predictions, trying to find a pattern. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a month. The lines themselves had changed. No longer just sentences, they became paragraphs, short stories detailing the final moments of lives with meticulous precision. He read the sounds of cars screeching, the scent of smoke before someone breathed their last, the final words someone whispered. He was horrified, fascinated, complicit. A realization emerged, slow and terrifying. The notebook seemed to respond to him. If he didn't read its lines, events sometimes didn't occur, or happened differently. But once he gave it his attention, even for a second, the ink burned into reality. He had become the conduit, the witness, the accomplice. Then came the line that stopped him cold. A line written in familiar, jagged scrawl, "He will die at midnight." No name. No context. Simon reread it. He realized, with a dread that hollowed his chest, that this time, the notebook meant him. He tried to rationalize it. He was careful, cautious. He had survived every other prophecy. But the ink had never been wrong. Not once. And now it had drawn its line upon him, invisible to anyone else. Midnight came. Rain lashed against the windows. The air grew cold, damp. Simon's heartbeat throbbed in his ears. Then, impossibly, the ink in the notebook began to move. Words twisted and shifted, forming new sentences as if alive. They scrawled with furious speed, "It was never him. It was never you. The writer watches." Simon dropped the notebook. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Silence enveloped the apartment, except for the rain. And then he understood, the notebook was not predicting deaths. It was writing them. Not outside the world, but inside the story it had chosen to tell. He was merely a character, a conduit, a witness to its narrative. He backed away, trembling. He knew, with the certainty of someone trapped in a nightmare, that the manuscript had more to say. More names would appear. More lives would be consumed. If he didn't stop reading, close the book, destroy it, the ink would continue, unstoppable, rewriting the world itself. He thought of the people he had tried to save, of the friends who laughed, of strangers who had brushed past him. Every life was a page. Every tragedy, a paragraph. And now, with the manuscript on the floor, the story had returned to him. Simon could not fight it. Could not run. Could not hide. The words called to him, insistent, humming in the silence. Trembling, he picked up the notebook once more, knowing the next sentence would be the most important one yet, his own. Rain slowed. The city outside began to wake. Sirens faded into morning hum. In the quiet apartment, Simon Hale wrote the final line of the manuscript, knowing it was the line that would never be read aloud, the one the world would never witness, except in the space where ink and ashes meet. And as the first light of dawn touched the edges of the page, he whispered, almost reverently, "Some stories are never meant to be finished."